So this book is about racism and racists in general. So it starts from history, how it was born and how it developed, and then here are our consideration main problem we bumped into. So the writer, she's British, but she has some Indian origins as well as Italians. So she is in a kind of way of a scientist that analyzed some other scientists that came before her and talks about their thought.
One of the things that I found interesting with the book was this archaic idea of social Darwinism. The book alarms the reader to its use as a tool for European cultivation of wealth. It acted as the ideological basis for European powers warrant their colonization of countries. And it talks about bringing them up to modern standards, quote unquote. With backing, it gave colonization legitimacy behind acts that wouldn't be ethically viable or legal. The ideology didn't deem non-white Europeans as evolved Homo sapiens, but a less developed or offshoot species of human. These ideas were propelled by popular culture at the time, and it further emphasized a fictional need for white intervention.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute my mic. So the fundamental misconception that Angela Saini debunks is this idea that there's such a thing as biological race. We all think that we know what race is because we are able to classify ourselves when we're asked, on the census form or whatever. But actually, when you look at it biologically and the genetics around this, there are really no hard, distinct boundaries, and it's all statistical, and it gets fuzzier the bigger the group gets. Next slide, thanks, Laura. No, previous slide.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, sorry. No, I'm sorry. Yeah. So throughout the book, Angela Saini also talks about biases. So around 1756, the Enlightened philosophers, many of them couldn't think beyond the fact that when they looked out into the world, white men were in charge, and they kind of framed that as the hierarchy. And all that they were doing was looking at the world around them and just assuming that what they saw reflected biology, when in fact, the world reflected politics and the social circumstances, oppression, slavery, and lots of different things. And I guess it's something that we still do in current times. So after World War II, with Nazi racial hygiene and eugenics, scientists realized that this hierarchical way of thinking about race was scientifically and morally vacuous. So there was this attempt to look beyond race and population genetics came into place. But if you look at it, it looks a lot like old-fashioned race. Like this map here, it's pretty it's not diverse enough, right? If you go to the next slide, Laura. Yeah. So, and I think we can learn a lot from these scientists as designers, because these scientists, they had really good intentions. They were kind of overwhelmingly anti-racist. They were professionals in their field. People looked up to them, but they were still kind of not aware of their own societal biases and political beliefs while they were kind of collecting data and making these maps, and they thought they were above all this, above their political beliefs and the science and societal basis. They thought they were above all that, and it wouldn't really affect them. But because they thought that, I think that's one of the reasons why they failed. And also, they were looking at something like race from their singular lens, I don't think it was interdisciplinary enough. You can't just look at something as complex as race from a scientific or biological perspective. And we often put things into categories and we look at it from our lens, and that way we don't really get a good understanding of people or even issues as a whole. And another thing that might have affected like how these scientists came up with the results is that they kind of relied very heavily on the previous work done by previous scientists, and that's what informed them. And they didn't question if their data collection methods were right or wrong, and they kind of just accepted it and didn't really question it. Yeah, that's my part.
So another key part that we sort of took from the book was the idea that the issue of racism and what race actually is was heavily shaped by power. So it was sort of early European scientists that started the idea of what we now call race, and they basically sifted the human race into like human types. I think it was 5 types. So the European scientists at the time were sort of desperate to use science to sort of prove a way of why they're sort of more powerful and why they're a better race. So there's sort of this immense amount of research trying to prove that there was a superior race, which obviously has led to sort of inbuilt issues with our sort of systems in current day. So it's sort of this early established belief of being better married with the notion of a superior race that racism sort of became a reality. And an example of this is eugenics. So eugenics is sort of mentioned in the book, and it's the idea that scientists believed that you could sort of breed out impurities, and they sort of wanted a master race and like a purer race. So they would sterilize people, and they would sort of encourage like selective breeding to sort of breed out whether it's like disease or poverty or something like that. And it was sort of really sort of introduced especially into British and American history. So yeah, until sort of like the concentration camps of Adolf Hitler was sort of liberated, it was sort of brought into public eye how horrific they were, that British labs that were dedicated to eugenics started closing down and sort of renaming themselves to genetics labs. So they sort of not necessarily pointed the finger, but tried to hide away when they realised that the sort of idea of trying to create a master race is inhumane. And yeah, but I think it's interesting how, especially in British culture, how that's sort of a hidden part of our history that isn't really spoken about.
So one example of a design that we found that isn't inclusive is this optical heart rate monitor in wearable fitness trackers. Basically, consumer devices that track heart rate rely on optical sensors that monitor the volume of blood in between beats. There is less blood volume at your wrist, and therefore more light that reflects back to the sensor. In short, skin with more melanin blocks green light, making it harder to get an accurate reading. The darker your skin, the harder it gets. So whether this is intended or not in the design, it pretty much excludes the whole user group based on the tone of your skin.
This is another example. So during the pandemic, obviously most of us has to cover with the face mask. So the debate was about Muslim women having to wear burqas, for example. And so what they asked to the government is that instead of a mask, they could just keep using the burqa on the top, so that in any case, the mask will cover the burqa underneath. But after the pandemic, France just rejected it. And so it just, even though the pandemic is still there and the face mask has to be still kept in place, they just wouldn't change their mind. So this kind of face covering, which is part of their culture, is absolutely forbidden in France.
So I suppose my sort of main takeaway from the book is that it sort of highlighted how racism is still very like inbuilt into our modern ways of life currently, in ways that I had never thought of. So as a design practitioner, I sort of want to create designs that aren't just like inclusive and non-discriminatory, but sort of go above and beyond that by informing more people of issues that they might not necessarily know about, and attempting to rule out or reduce the most common forms of racism in like today's society.
So the power of nationalism is that it calls into the part of us that doesn't want to be ordinary. I mean, just a quote I like, but I guess as a designer, I think I really want to look at these many social constructs around me and not just blindly follow them, but kind of question these things. And another thing that I hope to do is to, try and be aware of my biases and try to look at the same problem or issue at hand from various perspectives.
Yeah, so a quote I liked was, if you define humanity in some universal sense, then it's very restrictive. So in my future, I just want to keep on educating and developing my own knowledge on different issues by observing, questioning, and trying to, again, think outside my own bias, trying to empathize with other people's experiences, to design to be inclusive and respectful, and hopefully tackle real issues seen by a community.
Thank you. That's all of you, right?
Sorry, it was mine still missing. So the quote I decided to pick is, you could call race two groups, two completely different folks, and treat them as divided, or you could just celebrate each of them and say they're different and that they both have strengths and weaknesses. So with this quote, I really want to try and meet as many people as possible and make new connection and learn new thing, and take all the good for it, because it can really help developing myself as well as the design process that I want to make, and make everything more bright and useful, I guess. So yeah.
Thank you. What a positive note to end on. Okay, I'm going to pass that over to other people because I see Hannah already has her hand up. Hannah, before you ask your question, should we just let them unshare the screen?
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Thank you. Great. Hannah.
Hi. It was kind of less of a question, more something that I was wanting to discuss maybe with you guys since you read that book. So what my kind of point is that, so like Plan B in the pill, that I think some people could kind of argue the way that it was used is kind of like a modern form of eugenics as well. So there was like a big thing where the government was targeting Black African American minority groups with the pill, and I don't know, I just wanted to get your kind of opinion on whether or not you kind of see that as almost like a modern day form of eugenics, because like targeting those poor communities is almost like trying to stop their population from growing.
I don't deny there could be like a conspiracy behind that, but that could just be due to like lower income housing, like typically having a higher birth rate.
Yeah.
But another thing is that eugenics wasn't only for sort of race that they sort of tried to breed out. It was also disabilities, disease, poverty, and I think generally it was just sort of characteristics that were undesirable. So it was really quite horrific, to be honest, that it was. So whether it's like your sort of wealth or your poverty, they genuinely believed that that was a genetic issue, and that they tried to breed it out to create a better race. So yeah, it could be that was sort of a modern form of it.
I mean, maybe I can add that Sweden only got rid, and we think of Sweden as really socially progressive, only got rid of its eugenics program in the 1960s. And now I'm thinking maybe they just renamed the labs. And I think that I found really interesting, one of you who said designers have a lot to learn from this. The idea that some of that wasn't deliberately insidious. It wasn't, in the way you were saying, it wasn't deliberately racist. Some of the eugenics, they really thought that this was important for healthcare, but that doesn't mean that it's based on faulty science. And I love that point that as designers, we must learn to think that even, for instance, when we do human-centered design, it sounds great, right? But what is it that we are not seeing? Who is affected by our design that we haven't taken into account? And I love that. And I hear all the time now that you don't have to be worried about racists because they're very open. You have to be worried about progressives who are simply not aware, but it's very hidden, their bias. Well, no, the effect of their biases is very impactful in the world, but they really believe they're doing good. And I think that point was so good. Any other questions? Mitali, is that a question from you? And Sean?
Yeah, I was just kind of. Wait, who wants to go first?
Okay, you go ahead first.
No, I was just adding to Hannah's point. She's right. Cause I've done some research into the history of the American company Planned Parenthood, and how that was founded by a white supremacist eugenics leader who believed in obviously giving people the illusion of their child's not ready to be born because of health defects, for convincing black mothers to abort their baby. So it is an interesting thing by giving someone the choice, but misleading them with false information in order to persuade them to not have their child, which is an interesting thing. So yeah, I get where Hannah's coming from.
Mitali?
It was a really interesting presentation. I was particularly shocked by the example of the wearable device where the heart rate is not monitored as accurately. And I kind of wanted to ask, how do we as designers working in this field essentially overcome that? Because we could, in our next design, unknowingly put in that same monitoring device into our design without realizing that it could also be cutting out half of the population's access to it. So how should we sort of manage that?
Well, in that case, I think that you should take a step back and go back in the technology itself. So you should talk to some people that know about science, because the problem that is related to that device is that the rays that it emits in order to read the blood cell pressure and all of that stuff, just because the skin of black people it's tend to be harder because they had to, because in their past, in the recent past, considering all the development of genetics and everything, it tends to be harder, and so the ray cannot get all the information. So maybe you can try and study with people that actually are from that field, how they can overcome this problem, maybe by installing it somewhere else, or in the part of a body in another different one, or I don't know, just maybe developing other technologies. I think just you have to do a lot of tests and see if it works. So
maybe I can just jump in there. I've put in the chat for everybody a project called Gender Shades, which looks at the same problem in facial recognition technology. And this is a brilliant, really young, mid-20s computational PhD researcher at MIT in America, who's also a spoken word poet. And it's a short 15-minute presentation where she shows how facial recognition technology misrecognizes people of color much more, and female people of color most. And actually gender, so it's the same kind of issue, but her point there is slightly different to what you brought up there. It's that actually the bias is written into the technology, because so this relates to the first book, Invisible Women, because the technology is calibrated to recognize a white male skin. It's 100% perfect on recognizing certain skins, but less accurate when you break down the data on recognizing ones that are not based on the norm. So there's one example, that's an example where it's about calibrating the technology that is the issue. It's not a genetic or it's not a skin color issue. It's a technology not kind of being imprecisely calibrated with not enough data from everybody. Okay, so any other questions? Because then we're going to move on to the next presentation. Any final? I think we had some great questions there.
I just wanted to quickly.
This is just about.
Okay. I don't know who that is. You can go first.
I think, Charlie, is it a new point? I'm aware that we've got a lot of presentations, and you've already asked a question.
No, I just wanted to say that okay. With the
We've lost you. Okay. So thanks, guys. I thought that was a really great presentation. That's a really difficult book. And last year, people didn't manage to get design examples. They didn't manage to get a design discussion out of the book. So you completely got the book, and you also enacted a brilliant design discussion and got the audience interested. So thank you. Okay, so now we're going to move to B3.